Hello, everybody. We are going to be talking about marriage in this section from chapters 10 and 11. It's around the two chapters of understanding each other and also relationships and context. And one of the biggest contexts out there for a relationship is still marriage. Now, the definition of marriage is a legally and socially recognized relationship that includes sexual, economic, and social rights and responsibilities for partners. You'll notice this doesn't have gender or sex attached to it. It is a broad definition. Currently, that is something that we recognize marriage to be defined by legal organizations. And so in the United States, right now, it's two partners, but it can be partners of the same sex, or they can make male, female. There's lots of ways in which we are seeing this definition change, but this is the technical definition that we use. In Module 5, I'd like you to watch the video by Liza Shaw. She's one of those folks that has worked with marriages, and especially when they're about to break down and dissolve. And so she's learned a lot, and I really like what she has to say. She's not the most dynamic speaker. She sits through the whole time while she's doing her discussion. But there are two or three things especially that I think she has to say, especially about compromise and knowing that we don't always need to compromise. We need to come to good solutions together. And sometimes that involves something different than both of us were wanting, or doing that give and take. And then there's also some other things about how we fight, how we do things. So I invite you to watch that. I think it will help you understand a little bit about the context of marriage that I'm talking about. Now, I use another text for another class on family in the social context, and Andrew Cherlin is a professor of sociology and public policy at Johns Hopkins and the author of The Marriage Go-Round. And I really like a lot of things that he helps us understand about marriage. First of all, he says it's alive and well. Despite the fact that we see divorce, we see marriages happening. Demographers project that at least 80% of Americans will marry at some point in their lives. And that's as early as 2013. That's a pretty early source, and we're still seeing people get married, sometimes not with the intention of forever, sometimes thinking forever. But this is something that is happening. And the answer is that Americans are now marrying for different reasons than before. People, when they marry, might be a little older. So we're not seeing younger people under the age of 28 jump in as early. The average age right now is 28. It used to be a little bit lower for women. That's catching back up. And it's become a status symbol. It's highly regarded marker, especially in American society, even though we know that there's lots of different expressions of how people live their lives are in relationships, or whether they even choose to be in an intimate relationship that involves sexual connection or romantic connection. We do recognize that the status symbol is given tax breaks and titles and a sense of people even seeing you differently. And that's still an important part of what society expects out of people. One thing we need to know is education level does matter in marriage, because we are seeing people cohabitate a lot of times at lower levels of education. Many reasons it's out there for that, but education, if you have a higher education, you tend to marry. So according to the National Center for Family and Marriage Research, 88% of the 35 to 44-year-old women with four-year college degrees have married. So that's close to over 80, that number of over 80% will get married, but that's four-year college degrees compared to 79% of those with high school diplomas. So they're still pretty high on both options, but we do see that education matters. In fact, young adults without college degrees are increasingly likely to put off marriage and have their first children in cohabiting relationships, sometimes years before they're married. This is becoming more and more part of people trying to get their grip before entering into a long-term relationship. Sometimes it has to do with employment. Sometimes it has to do with education that they may be trying to get, or maybe it's also that they just can't afford it, and that's an important aspect that a lot of people say, I can't afford to be married. So nearly all of the increase in childbearing, when we were talking about people having children before getting married, almost all of that increase is outside of marriage in the last two decades is from births to cohabiting couples, most without college degrees rather than single mothers. So we've often had that stigma that it's a single mom that's out there having all these children, maybe young single mothers, but really the increase in childbearing that we've seen outside of marriage is from that cohabitation. The weakening link between marriage and childbearing is perhaps best explained by the hollowing out of the middle of the American economy. This is another piece where we are seeing less and less people that grow up in small rural towns or even suburban areas maintain their residence in their hometown. And so we see a lot of people that are urbanizing, and that's a pretty strong weakening link too, as far as people wanting to get married right away, because sometimes they're wanting to settle maybe in another part of the country, especially with that higher education degree, that it may give better opportunities. But this is also important for industrial fields, and we see farming as it continues to not necessarily maintain the family farm, but seeing more industrialization and corporations involved in that. And that is another part, is that men tend to be able to find jobs in these suburban and rural areas, but women don't. And so you need women a lot of times for childbearing. It doesn't mean that, same-sex relationships can't happen, that type of thing, but it's like the traditional understanding of marriage and growing up in your hometown, that is really dissolving. And what we call that is the hollowing out, where people in those small towns are just not staying there. And we're seeing the aging of those communities, and we're seeing those opportunities for people to marry somebody they may have gone to high school with. All of that start to dissolve more. As jobs have been automated or moved overseas, it also has become more difficult for high school educated young men to find some sort of steady, well-paying industrial work that sustain their father's family. So they too are moving to often urbanized areas to work in places that may be able to give a higher income. And so we are seeing a depletion of that younger generation. We saw a lot of marriage coming out of young, small town, suburban, or and unurban areas, and that's just shrinking. Young women also, for their part, may choose to have children with these short-term unions that they're in, rather than wait for the uncertain prospect of a marriage. And so we see also marriage not necessarily being something for people who, what we call the stayers in these small suburban areas or rural areas. We don't see marriage as something that they may want to invest in. They may want to be in a relationship and have a child, but then they too may see themselves as migrating somewhere so that they may have better opportunities. In contrast, more than 90% of American women with 4-year college degrees wait till after they're married to have children. And so just like the higher education plays a part in when people marry and if they marry, so does higher education play a big role in whether and how a person has children and when they do. College-educated young adults foresee a brighter economic future that can sustain marriages. And so we are seeing some changes there, but it just takes getting past those earlier stages. And so when we see a whole cohort of young people decide to wait on marriage, we see less marriages on the statistical tables. In the 1970s, when cohabitation began to increase and divorce rates skyrocketed, it seemed like marriage might fade away, but really, it's just not going to at this point. It may be redefined, just like we're redefining how we put coupleship together or intimate relationships together, marriage together. It's just being remade. 4 decades later, it remains so important to American life that not only its older role as the first step into adulthood, but it's a newer role as the last step. one takes after becoming an adult in almost all other respects, meaning we see communities still give high regard to people who, even if they make that decision later in life, is still seen as a role of adulthood. Now, I'm going to say this personally. I know many single people who have never been married, that are seen as adults in their community. But this time and age in the American society, we still see that expectation placed on most people. And so we have to know ourselves, how we feel and think, and how we react to how people are coming at us with all of this, because our relationships, I don't know if you've ever experienced this, but been in a long-term relationship and some family member is like, so when are you popping the question? Or when do you think you're going to get married? That is still thrown out there, but it's important. If you don't want to get married, or if you don't see that as the route, but that you may be in long-term commitment, that is something that we're learning, and we're seeing more and more people gain some sort of strength in knowing. So I want you to evaluate yourself as a person who searches for relationships that cause drama and pain. This is the next thing we have to recognize, is that there's a lot of pressure from the world sometimes to go out and get married. And there's sometimes what we've seen people still trying to say, I need to do this before a certain time, especially young people, even if that clock is ticking in a particular way. And so what we sometimes see is people constantly searching out that person. And it can always be sometimes qualities that are something that's initially attractive in a partner, but then some of those qualities may actually end the relationship over time, and that's called fatal attraction. And what that means is that sometimes we're trying to, find that right person. Remember when I talked about The Bachelor? I think all of The Bachelor attractions are fatal, to be honest. And when we look at those initially attractive things, what society tells us is attractive, or what we have convinced ourselves is attractive. Oh, that person will be a stable provider, or that person will be part of a partnership that's equal, and I want to see all of us acting together in a certain way. You're looking for those qualities sometimes to try to get married sometimes. And really what you need to recognize is going back to those initial pieces of what attracts you. What do you like about yourself? How do you have that mutualness with another person? Also knowing chemically what's going on, and knowing also what's going on in long-term commitment. So we then turn to motives. And I use this as kind of my turn, because we've been talking about the definition of marriage, what it's been doing. But I think it's important for us to recognize motivations and how we do relationships anyway. And this is not just pertaining to marriage. This is pertaining to any type of motivation we might have. And so we have to evaluate ourselves again when we're thinking about our relationships with people, especially that we're going to be considering a long-term relationship with our families and our friends, and know ourselves about why we do what we do. So motivated reasoning refers to all the ways our motives, desires, and preferences bias the way information is selected. So we may see things and interpret things and organize the purpose of satisfying specific needs and achieving specific goals. Sorry, I have a spelling error there. I'll correct that for the slides. But that's the most important thing. What is pushing you into this relationship? And I often tell people that's important when I do marriage counseling or premarital counseling. I ask the question, why are you getting married? In this day and age, and I want them to be able to tell me, what's that motivation? Because we often call a bias, we often have a bias, a tendency to process information to protect a particular kind of view. And I've found couples that sometimes one person comes in, they are gung-ho to get married, but the other person may not feel like they are ready or even ever wanted to get married. They love the person. There's no question about the love. They are committed to the person. But sometimes that motivation has a bias, and that bias is still pronged by what's going on in society, having that expectation that people find each other and eventually go beyond cohabitation and marry. So we have to recognize our biases, and we have to know that about our friends too. Why are you trying to be with a friend? Why are you trying to talk one part of your family up and the other part you're not so interested in talking to? What are your biases? So we're going to look at a couple of reasons that bias can be seen in a positive light, because you obviously have motives. You've had socialization. Maybe you knew from a very young age that marriage was something that was for you and you really wanted to do that. But you haven't really thought about the motives, and also what it is you want. That's really what that is at the end, is what's moving you to what you want. So first of all, the enhancement motive affects the way a partner processes a relationship, which leads to enhancement bias that supports positive beliefs about a partner and a relationship. And what that means is, sometimes have you been in a relationship and even things that you didn't know before, suddenly you start to see this person in a different light, and you see, okay, maybe they were balding a little bit when you first start dating, and you wouldn't have seen yourself necessarily with this person that's balding because you had these ideas of bias. Maybe that meant aging or whatever. But later on, when you get in that relationship, you start to say, what's really cool is that I really kind of like how this person looks. I've gotten used to this. It's actually the face that I love. And you start to see the enhancements of that. The cute little belly fat that I've gotten used to. It's this positiveness about the relationship, and it's trying to promote basically who you are. So a lot of times the enhancement motive is going on, especially when a couple has gotten used to each other a little bit more. And so satisfied partners, we see over time, if that's the motive, that they see each other as something that they grow more supportive, and they think of themselves in positive light together, that's actually a pretty good motive. And a lot of times that can help, especially in making long-term decisions or that decision of marriage. Although positive light is good, this is another thing that happens, though. People can talk themselves up too much, and they're really just putting on a mask. So this is really the motive that I like the most. It's called the accuracy motive, which is better for any relationship, which is the desire to understand a partner and to be understood in return. This goes back to what I was saying about compromise. I am married to a man that for 26 years really hates to go to the airport any later than like 3 hours before it. I, on the other hand, can show up an hour before and be fine. I feel fine. I can rush through stuff. We don't try to compromise on that whole entire thing. Instead, we've come up with different solutions. And the solution often is that if we go early, then we're going to eat dinner at some place so that I'm not just going to the airport to sit. And that may sound like a compromise, but I really like to, sit down, have a good drink before, get something to eat that I like. Airports have often really great places to eat. And so there's this desire of what we both want. That's different than a compromise. A compromise would be, okay, I'm going to get there 3 hours early and we're going to do it exactly the way you do it. And or, oh no, Mitch, you just have to relax. I'm going to go an hour earlier. So that accuracy of knowing he has anxiety, and when it comes to flying, I need to recognize that anxiety, and I'm not trying to dumb that down. I don't have that anxiety. I have the accuracy of saying I've flown by the seat of my pants literally for such a long time that I feel very comfortable with that. But the solution is, if we're both wanting to enjoy the time, because I hate waiting in airports. I really hate it unless there's some sort of fun thing attached to it. That's kind of what accuracy motive is. Now, when you're getting married or considering a long-term relationship, it is so crucial to do accuracy. And I often tell people, even though you may be seeing 100% of this love experience with this other person, so when a young couple will come in, or even an older couple that's giddy from all those chemicals that are going on. Often tell them your first assignment is not to tell me all the things you love about the person, but I want you to both think of 3 things you love that endears you to that person. And then I also want you to think of 3 things you hate. You absolutely can't stand. And you have to tell each other this. You're going to go out to some sort of a date, go to Sonic, get a drink, listen to each other. 90% of the time, you're not going to be surprised by the stuff that you hate about the other person. And I use the word hate because I, for a long time, hated how Mitch did laundry, how he did the dishes. I mean, little things like that, but also the big things like the going to the airport early. So accuracy motive is saying, say those things out there. Desire to understand that person. You are creating a life of communication together. And that's what really builds those bonds of love and trust. So that's an important thing. This can lead to 2 types of bias when you're looking, by the way, at real accurate motives as to why you're doing this. Why am I getting married? Why am I not getting married? Why am I in this relationship? And when you're accurate, it creates two very clear things. First, diagnostic, a preference that may indicate important qualities in a partner or relationship. So you're getting to diagnose that together, and you get to know that. 90% of the time, people aren't trying to have you solve their problems. They just want you to know them. That's what intimacy is. It's that vulnerability and that curiosity. Once again, that's what you're doing here is you're sharing your preferences. Going back to your personality types, based on your personality tests, this is the same kind of stuff. You're trying to share who you are, and you have been that person for a long time, and you may change over time, but those basic things that you know about yourself, as who you are really crucial to your own health and happiness. So that's important, is knowing the diagnosis, knowing it together. And then finally, confirming a preference for information that supports what is already known about a partner or relationship. When you're accurate, you are trying to just share the accurate stuff rather than, I'm worried that this person, my partner, is not going to listen to me because they'll be offended. Or I'm really worried that, I'm trying to make this sweet talk the situation a little bit. Those tend to really, in the long run, rub the whole conversation the wrong way. And the whole communication of that relationship is based more on what I would call that is negative relationships, negative types of reactions, because you're assuming that the other person's going to be mad or upset. Whereas really, it's more preferred that you're with a person that you know and that you trust and you can be vulnerable with. Another motive we see is the justification to feel that you are right or moral. This especially plays a part in marriage and before, after, during. A lot of times I see people that it's more important for them to be right and moral than it is for them to be accurate or even have that sense of positivity. And so I often tell people this is a tough one. It often goes with certain personality types. And if you are this kind of person, it's not a judgment on that. It is that you know this about yourself, that you are a person that tends to want to be right. I feel that way personally. I'm a thinker that works on a lot of statistical information and working in this area and field of sociology. There's a lot of times I feel like I know a lot more than certain people around me. That's a motive that isn't always welcomed. It may actually be in the scientific field, but in a relationship, it's difficult. So just to name that, to say, it makes me so angry because I want to be right. That's okay. I think a lot of people want to be right. But if that's the only motive, for example, getting married and saying, we have to get married because it's the right thing to do. How many of you have heard that? Who says it's the right thing to do or the moral thing to do? And going back to those expectations, you may have that expectation yourself, somebody else might not. So that is where you see yourself at a self-serving basis, the tendency to take credit for that success and blame others for the failure. So, hey, we're not getting married, or we're not making this long-term commitment, or we're not in a friendship that is, you giving 100%. Obviously, I'm giving 100%. You're not as much. Or family members, it's all their fault. That's that type of motive. And I often caution people, it's not a bad thing. It's part of some of our personalities if we're aware of it. What we've been working on is breaking through this selective attention that is the realization that we can only focus on a certain number of conversations, aspects in our life. And what I mean by that is all through this semester, we've been kind of building what an intimate relationship is based on levels of intimacy, being attentive to our relationships, wanting that same attention as well, and knowing that there are different skills and skill levels that we can do, skill sets, I should say. And so empathy accuracy is a model where partners should be motivated to attend to understand what each other's thinking and feeling, and the level of help is determined by that level of selective attention we give to our partner and the level of sharing about our own needs and wants and being comfortable with that. I hope over this last 5 weeks that you've felt that sense of recognizing some things you need to grow on with whatever relationships you have in your life. That first of all, empathy is that sense of caring about the other person's needs, but not sympathizing, not always saying my needs are exactly what your needs are. It's that you understand what those needs are. You understand their personality. You understand their motives, and vice versa. That those relationships have that same level of empathy coming back at you, and that you're working at that together. Mel Robbins does a really great little TED Talk called Screwing Yourself Over, and it really goes into this. It's so important for our intimate relationships to be developed in a way that we are working on ourselves, and we're working on ourselves being good communicators about what we need and want. And it's not selfish. It's actually putting it out there as an accurate representation. And that is a very scary thing for people because we're often taught to put all these masks on. But please watch that. I think you'll find it entertaining. So this moves us into context. If we're in the context of thinking about marriage, that's different than if we're in the context of dating a person or exclusively talking to a person. It's different if we're in a familiar relationship with somebody or with a friendship. But all of those types of communication tools can apply. Everything that affects a relationship outside of the couple and their interactions includes physical, social, cultural, and historical elements is what we call context. And that affects our friendships. We talked about that earlier. So there's some ways in which that context can be either very close by or very distant. So proximal context, that's stuff that's right in front of us. It can be that you're sharing the time of day with the person. It's very different to be with a friend or a partner or a family member in the morning than it is at 6:00 at night. It can be very different for you to be sitting on the front porch with a person rather than in a classroom. What the person's day was like at the end of work and school, that these very immediate things that are within the 24-hour bracket of our life, that's what we call proximal context. Sometimes that proximal context can have major crisis happen. If you have a day where you've lost a parent, that affects the family relationship and dynamics. And it's a very proximal context, but it's not a usual context of what's going on in life. If, for example, you have found out that you lost your job, that's going to affect that very directness of the relationships around you. It may even be your best friend. These are the things that happen. Distal context is also important, which is that global and historical events that you are in direct contact with, but it still affects them. For example, after September 11th, there were a lot of people in the United States and around the world that suddenly felt this great loss of innocence, even though many of us knew that there was much, hype about that innocence anyway, that this is sometimes how the world works. But I know many people that were depressed for long periods of time. It affected relationships. Sometimes we saw friendships dissolve because people didn't get along politically anymore. We also saw a lot of relationships begin because people were recognizing that we had segregated ourselves and often weren't as global as we thought we were. And so you saw people reaching out across different religious and ethnic groups. So it's not always a negative thing. And that's the same true with the proximal. If you have had a great day and it affects the whole room, it can make a difference. If you've had a raise at work, it will affect the relationship. But being very aware of how those things work is really important. Stressors are something, however, that when it does tend to be a big deal, you can have a stressor if you've gotten a raise. It may be good news, but you also have more work on your hands and you have more responsibility. That stressor is fine sometimes when it's by itself. But when the environment makes demands on that partner, leaving them with reduced capacity to maintain that relationship, for example, let's say you get a raise, you start to get highly involved with the position and the company and the people you're working with. If you're not in a healthy, accurate, communicating relationship, it can often stress that relationship to a point where it won't maintain. This happens in marriages a lot of the time. We have people say we just went separate ways because we were workaholics. So it's also important for us to recognize when those stressors come that resources are important. It's a source of support outside the couple. Sometimes it contributes to their ability to interact effectively outside the family. If a family is going through a major loss, or let's say, one of the major supporters in the family has lost their job, if there are friends and neighbors that are there to help, if there are people making connections to help, find jobs in other ways, those resources can help people get through the stressors. But when they compound, it can be something that's really difficult. For example, a lot of people will see the positives and say, oh my gosh, it's so exciting to get married. I tell couples, as much as marriage is work, that getting married day is sometimes just one of the most stressful days if you have all these different people coming at you with their ideas and their types, their motivations, maybe their justification motivation is coming out a little bit. They're right, you're wrong. You should do this, you shouldn't do that. And so couples a lot of times will break up before the marriage ceremony, a lot of times, because that very outside, distal, and proximal world comes in on them, what society expects out of marriage, and also what family members or friends or even the couple is getting through. Same is true with divorce. It may be a good thing that you're getting divorced, but you're recreating a whole nother life. We're going to talk a little bit more about that next week, but all of the outside stressors sometimes can come into that. And it's not just about the couple. It's about who are our friends that we keep, or how do we decide where the children go if we have children, and how do we keep relationships with in-laws. It's all very high and complex. So I throw this stressor out there. The average cost of a wedding. My wedding, now this was way below average, but in 1991, with dress, cake, all the dresses for the bridesmaids, the church, the pastor, all of these things cost $837.27. And I still have the receipt to that. Today's average wedding costs $26,000. And there is a wedding cost sheet on this week's thread. And so I want you to look at those a little bit, because this is what often gets people super stressed, is our societal expectation. Now you'll see there was a dip here a little bit for the recession, but obviously not a big dip that catches up with my $800 wedding. So we need to recognize that weddings are becoming more and more expensive. It's becoming a societal expectation. So when we look at marriage costs, oh, that was on Thursday. Sorry, left that from some of my other slides. But if you want to choose to do that Thursday, great. How does the average cost of a wedding affect a couple? It may shock the hell out of them. They may be like, I can't believe how much the venue is. Now, not all these weddings cost this much, but averages obviously have super high ends and super low ends. But it's important to recognize a lot of times we're getting a couple into a good setting of dealing with their marriage, understanding all the things that they want to have in a successful relationship, by also teaching them how to have a successful wedding that is communicating what the couple wants and what they need. And so there's all these stressors: income, family support, status, all that stuff. And then finally, you have to get to the type of wedding traditions that will be kept, the veil, giving away vows. Do you know all of these used to be old traditions? For example, the bachelor party was often to go, often the woman was left someplace where she couldn't be found because they were afraid the best man would go try to take her and marry her. A lot of times the veil was trickery. It also was trying to keep off evil spirits. A lot of times things like I invite you just to look up the history of where these traditions come from. Something blue, something borrowed, all these things. We don't know what they are. And I have a sheet, I might put it up for this week, that tells about all those wedding traditions. And it's like, why do we keep doing that? Is that really representative of who we are? And do we want to make up our vows? Do we want to, what's the giving away? That used to be something that was literally a business transaction. This all adds into that stress. And this can then end up in stress pileup, which is the accumulation of stress when an adverse event leads to other adverse events. And I often lift this up. There are certain times in your life where you see stress pile up, especially prevalent. And that's when people are doing big marriage ceremonies or graduations, or when we see people going through funerals. The big stuff in life often can carry with it all the other stuff from the outside environment. And then what that does sometimes is spills over. And that's what we call the transmission of those effects from one domain of a person's life into another. So let's say, you're excited about this wedding, but you're getting stressed out by the in-laws. You're getting stressed out by the expenses and the costs. You're trying to also maintain your new job and try to keep in contact with your friends, but you are just stressed to the nth degree. You're not doing your job as well as you should, or that you feel comfortable with. You feel bad about that. That's when that stress spillover starts to come from that outside stressor of the wedding. Then crossover is when somebody else takes on the effect of that stress from another person. This often happens at these times as well, where I'm trying to get this to stop going. The transmission of the effects of the stress comes from one person, and then suddenly the other person starts to take it on as their stress. This is a really important aspect, and I often tell people we don't have enough time in this class to get at this, but if you take a good psychology class on relationships, I think it's really important for you to or counseling, that this is what we often talk about is don't take on the other person's problems. It will affect you. You have empathy, but at the same time, that's their stuff. And so that stress crossover can then become this negative reciprocity that keeps going back and forth. And it's important to keep them in the right camps, because sometimes in life we've been taught to do this, like this is the expectation for us to take on partners or families' stress. This is a natural thing that we do in our socialization as families, but it's not healthy. And especially when it gets to the point where you aren't even able to deal with your own issues because you're dealing with somebody else's. And that can lead to crisis, which is that negative response to a couple's experience of a stressful event. And it just blows up into something that's not just some sort of a stress or stress pileup. It's not stressors. it's crisis. It's gotten to this place where, once again, going back to the TED Talk that's earlier done, about marriage and family counseling, that's a very important aspect of it, is that we can get at these things before we get to the crisis. You have gotten through a lot of context, understanding each other a little bit more, trying to understand where stressors play a part. I hope this week we have a really good discussion. I know one of the stressors might be that you are coming to your end of the semester, end of the 6 weeks project. If you have any questions, please text me, let me know, email me. I get to my texts a little earlier than my emails. Or call me. That's fine as well. I'm looking forward to seeing those projects as we come along. Also, I will have some final exam prep sheets as well, so that you make sure to be aware of what I'm expecting. If you look over those questions really well, you should be prepared for that in the next couple weeks. So have a great day or night. Thanks for listening.